Well, good day everybody. This is Chris with the Ancient Scholar. I hope this video finds you all doing well. So in this video, I want to talk about some really important things that have happened to me. And this is something that has not happened for quite some time. And I feel absolutely blessed to have encountered this. And I hope this is something that happens to all of you in your life. And it happened a little earlier, and I'm just now talking about it because it was so jarring, and it is something that has changed my ontology, really. And ontology is just what you like bedrock reality, like what's the actual reality of the universe as you understand it. And this is something that is challenging my fundamental ontology. It's a very small thing, but still, this is not something that happens a lot. And it's interesting to kind of look back on it because I did not initially respond as I thought I would have. I consider myself kind of fairly enlightened and evidence-based, and yeah, I'm going to change my mind if I encounter evidence that is powerful and overwhelming, and that's not exactly what happened. So this is something that happened about a week ago, and I forget where. I think it was in just like a message board. You know what? Golly, it may have been Reddit, actually. It may have been a Reddit thread on hyperkalemia, and just somebody posted a link to a study. It was actually a study that was published this year, March of this year. I'll talk about it here in just a little bit. And it was in regards to hyperkalemia. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about the treatment of hyperkalemia and kind of the approach to hyperkalemia leading up to this shift of thinking that I'm kind of in the middle of experiencing. And so it's long been understood that the traditional way in which we think about treating hyperkalemia, the frontline emergency therapies for hyperkalemia, mainly calcium gluconate or chloride, calcium. The standard story that we tell ourselves and we tell everybody else is probably not entirely accurate, if at all accurate. And so the classic story that you hear about calcium is that calcium stabilizes the membrane, quote unquote, right? Membrane stabilization. What does that really mean? Well, what it really means, the concept of membrane stabilization, it has to do with the cardiac myocytes and the way in which a cardiac myocyte depolarizes and repolarizes. And so there is a potential across the membrane, right? And when you look at the resting potential, if you will, of the cardiac myocyte, there is a lot of potassium inside of the cell, a lot of sodium outside of the cell, and you have this difference of charge across the membrane, right? And it is more relatively negatively charged. It's not like there's like more negative charge. It's just there is a difference in the average concentration of charged particles inside and outside of the myocyte, right? The potassium inside, sodium outside, and it makes the potential across the membrane very negative. So it is to say that the inside of the myocyte is relatively negatively charged compared to the outside, and that creates a potential, right? And what happens is, if positively charged, if cations enter the myocyte, then the membrane potential decreases, right? And there is a point at which once the potential decreases and becomes less negative, there are a bunch of sodium channels in the membrane of that myocyte. And when they detect that change in potential, when it gets to a certain point, all of these sodium channels open up, and then massive amounts of sodium rush into the cell, and it undergoes that fast depolarization. And these are what we call voltage-gated ion channels or voltage-gated sodium channels. And there is a certain quote-unquote threshold that needs to be reached. And then once that threshold is reached, the sodium channels pop open, sodium rushes in, and you have fast depolarization of these myocytes. All right. And what happens is if you end up having a bunch of that potassium leak out of the cell, or a bunch of potassium outside of the cell, then what happens is the potential across that membrane is decreased, and those myocytes at rest are much closer to the threshold, and they're much more likely to depolarize. Okay, so they become irritable. So initially what happens in hyperkalemia is the myocytes, due to the membrane, the resting potential being closer to threshold, are more irritable, more likely to depolarize. But then what happens in fairly short order is when you have this potential and you have all this potassium outside of the cell, the cells kind of respond to that. And one of the responses is that the sodium channels quit working normally. And the sodium channels don't respond normally, or are not able to open up normally. Essentially, you've got a kind of like a downregulation, if you will, of the sodium channels in response to this hyperkalemia, this high amount of potassium outside of the cells, right? And what that does is that essentially manifests as a sodium channel blocker toxicity. It's not literally, but the overall effects are very similar, that prolonged hyperkalemia actually prevents the fast sodium channels from opening up, and that then impairs the depolarization and repolarization of the myocytes. And then what happens is you start seeing the QRS complex widen out, right? You start seeing the flattening of the P wave, P to R interval widens out. Eventually you lose a P wave and you just have this wide rhythm, this sign pattern. Is essentially like an accelerated idioventricular rhythm that kind of looks like VTAC, right? And then from there, you're at high risk for going into cardiac arrest, right? And so it is a kind of sodium channel blocker toxicity in a sense, right? So that is what happens, or that's kind of the classic story we teach. And so what we say is, when you administer calcium, when we say that calcium has membrane stabilizing effects, essentially what it does is you now add a bunch of calcium ions into the mix out in the bloodstream, and then you have a bunch of positive charge that you're kind of introducing, and then that calcium kind of moves around, and it kind of reestablishes a membrane potential that is a little more normal, if you will. And then calcium interacts with calcium channels, and those channels are also coupled to sodium channels, and then that can enable the sodium channels to begin functioning, and that is the other mechanism by which, right? So the stabilizing is the calcium ions kind of reestablishing a more normal resting potential that's not so close to the threshold, and then that's the membrane stabilization. And then the other major effects are that the calcium, it somehow in some way interacts with specific calcium channels that are coupled to sodium channels, and that allows the sodium channels to begin working again. All right. And then this kind of stabilizes the overall situation and kind of buys you some time, if you will. Okay. Now, that standard story that we teach people, it has been debated, and in fact, last year, October 2024, in Critical Care Medicine, there was a really cool article that was published by Pichtel, Wan, and all. And the name of that article is Beneficial Effect of Calcium Treatment for Hyperkalemia is Not Due to quote unquote membrane stabilization. And what they concluded, all right, and they did some really interesting studies on optical action potentials and volume averaged ECGs. And they took like little chunks of myocardial tissue essentially and studied this. So they took little wedges of myocardial tissue and they induced, in the lab, they induced hyperkalemic conditions, and then studied the actual myocytes individually. And so, it was not a live animal study, if you will, but, a very much a biological study. And what they noticed was that the primary mechanism is not due to membrane stabilization or even necessarily the sodium channels, but it seems to be a highly calcium channel dependent mechanism of some sort. And so it's this calcium dependent propagation that seems to play the biggest role, at least when we isolate small wedges of myocardium and look at individual myocytes in these highly controlled settings. So already the standard story is certainly not, it's on shaky ground, right? It's not actually very clear at all how calcium works to treat hyperkalemia, right? It's clear that the story is probably far more complicated than we understand and teach, but it works, right? It's like, it's the standard thing. It's the go-to thing. It's like the life-saving thing that buys us time, right? And so all this cool intellectual stuff aside, calcium's the standard of care, right? It always has been. And then I clicked on that article and I read the article, and instead of like going, whoa, this is interesting, I'll tell you all how I reacted to the article. I reacted like, no, oh, hell no, hell no. That's how I reacted. And I even told myself, hell no, I have given calcium and hyperkalemia. I have seen ECG changes. I know it works, right? This is my personal experience. Trust me, bro. Calcium works. No. And I didn't even read it. That is not a particularly enlightened response. Again, this happened about a week ago. I was like, oh, hell no. I don't believe this. I don't care what this is saying. I don't care how good this is. I don't believe it. I am not going there. I'm not even going to consider the possibility that what I have always understood about the universe, as far as the role of calcium in treating hyperkalemia, could be anything other than what I currently know to be the truth. My ontology was being attacked directly, and I responded in a very unenlightened way. There was an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance, and I was not going to grapple with it. And it's only been over, several days that I have like, okay, I really do need to take a look at this, and I need to grapple with this. And so the name of that article, or that study, if you will, goes, it was published in March of 25, I believe. March or April, I believe it was in March of 25, and it was published under the name of Pharmacological Interventions for the Acute Treatment of Hyperkalemia, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. So what these authors did, and this was Jessen Anderson et al. And it was just published in Resuscitation, the European Resuscitation Council, their journal that they have of resuscitation. So this is a legitimate journal. And so what they did was they actually reviewed a bunch of studies and created a systemic review and a meta-analysis of a lot of the prior research that has been done on the treatment of hyperkalemia. And so they looked at just over 100 studies. A couple of the studies even involved people in cardiac arrest, primarily adult patients without cardiac arrest, so pre-arrest adult patients were looked at, and they looked at a lot of the therapeutic interventions for hyperkalemia to include calcium, sodium bicarbonate, or bicarbonate in general, high-dose albuterol, dextrose, insulin, but dextrose. They also looked at neonatal and pediatric populations. So, they looked at a lot of different evidence, over 100 studies, and what were their conclusions? Well, their conclusions were very, very different from the standard story that we tell. And their conclusions were, at least in the adult patients, the use of bicarbonate and potassium had really no impact on how well patients did. Okay, like what the ultimate outcomes were, how did they do, did they survive or not? There was just, did they have additional complications? There's just no evidence that, okay, maybe you give calcium and the ECG changes and it looks awesome, but people getting discharged home, people going into cardiac arrest, it just didn't make any difference in people that got calcium and bicarbonate versus other therapies. And again, this is kind of messy, right? This is messy. This is a real world. You're looking at a lot of different studies, but you would think that if calcium was so effective, that there would be a very strong signal in all the evidence that's out there, right? There should be some sort of strong signal if it is calcium is like the definitive life-saving intervention that buys us time, and that's not at all what they found. They found essentially the same thing in neonatal and pediatric populations. And so their conclusions were that evidence did support, there were some treatments that there was a signal, mainly insulin and glucose, right? So this is actually really good evidence, and insulin and glucose has been one of the therapies, just not the initial, right? We always teach, give them calcium, give them bicarb, buy yourself some time, and then you can do all these other things. Well, this is saying it really looks like that insulin and glucose, as well as large doses of albuterol, seem to be more effective, or at least there's a signal there, right? There's actually evidence of benefit versus calcium. So this is interesting, and it's compelling. And if I really kind of pull back and I look at it objectively, it does seem to suggest that perhaps calcium does not play as a critical role in the life-threatening, in the management of life-threatening hyperkalemia, and perhaps certain therapies like insulin. It's really the insulin, I think, that drives potassium back into the cells, and then the dextrose to prevent the hypoglycemia. But insulin and high doses of albuterol may actually be the more important frontline interventions, and this may have implications for the pre-hospital and emergency care of patients with suspected and diagnosed hyperkalemia, because this may push to rearrange our treatment priorities in these patients. And perhaps this is the first step in deprioritizing calcium. But it's a fascinating read. It's an open access article, so you don't have, it's not behind a paywall, so you can look it up, download the PDF, look at it yourself. It's it's a pretty well done study. Like I said, it does. It is a real world, quote unquote. It's looking at real world evidence, and so the studies they look at, there are biases, and so it's messy. But again, if calcium is truly as awesome as we've always, at least me, I've always thought it was, there should be a really strong, solid signal, and they're not seeing it. This is fascinating, and now that I've kind of gotten over the initial cognitive dissonance and I'm integrating it, my worldview is changing. So I just wanted to make this video for you all and point these different these studies out, and hopefully you find this interesting, and perhaps this video challenges what you've always thought about the emergency treatment of life-threatening hyperkalemia. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.